Thank you for being here with me today. Before I begin my story, I would love to know which city you are joining us from. Please feel free to share in the comments. So, if you have a moment, pour yourself a cup of coffee or maybe something a little stronger. Settle in. Now, let me take you into this story. It all started on what should have been a perfectly normal, even triumphant Tuesday. I was staying at a hotel in Denver, and the air conditioning hummed a low, lonely tune, a mechanical sigh that seemed to echo the emptiness of the room. It was a completely generic space with beige walls, uninspired corporate art, and a large window that overlooked a sea of glittering city lights, which honestly only made me feel smaller and farther from home. I sat on the edge of the mattress, kicking off my uncomfortable black heels, feeling the cheap carpet beneath my toes. It was 11:30 at night, and I was bone tired, but I was also buzzing with a kind of electric energy. It was the specific kind of energy that comes after 3 days of relentless work culminating in a massive professional victory. I had been at a national sales conference representing my firm, spending my days shaking hands, smiling until my cheeks ached, and reviewing financial projections until the numbers blurred together. That very afternoon, after weeks of stressful negotiations and a nail-biting final presentation where my palms sweat so much I had to discreetly wipe them on my skirt, I had officially closed the Henderson account. This was not just another deal for our firm. This was the deal. It was the massive contract that would secure our division's budget for the next 2 years, the one that came with a corner office and a brand new vice president title attached to my name. A promotion was no longer just likely, it was practically a certainty. My boss had shaken my hand so hard I genuinely thought he might break my fingers. His face had split into a massive grin, and in that conference room, I felt a surge of pride, a deep and profound satisfaction that came from knowing I had earned this. My salary was going to increase significantly, which was a huge relief. All I wanted in that moment, with an ache that was sharp and sudden, was to share this incredible news with the one person whose validation truly mattered to me. My husband, Declan. Declan and I had been married for 10 years, a solid, comfortable decade of building a life together. We had been together for 12 years overall, ever since we were practically kids, fumbling our way through our early 20s in tiny apartments eating cheap noodles. He was my rock, my absolute best friend, my other half. He was the man who remembered I hated cilantro, the one who could always make me laugh with a stupid face when I was completely stressed out over a deadline, the one who had held my hand for hours through my father's health scare 2 years ago. We had built a life together, a beautiful, carefully constructed life in a quiet suburban neighborhood. Our home was our sanctuary, completely paid for using the inheritance my grandmother left me, filled with the scent of his dark roast coffee in the morning and the sound of the classic rock station he always had playing while he cooked breakfast. Our life was a rhythm, predictable and safe. Or so I had believed with every fiber of my being. Before calling Declan, I had made the obligatory phone call to my biological mother, Sybil. My own birth family was a completely different story from the warm home Declan and I had built. It was always much more complicated, a complex web of unspoken resentments and carefully maintained facades. At the absolute center of that web was my younger sister, Maeve. To say Maeve and I were different would be a massive understatement. Growing up, Maeve was the glowing sun and I was just the dull planet caught in her gravitational pull. She was the beautiful one, the charming one, the one who could light up any room and have everyone eating out of the palm of her hand within minutes. I was the quiet one, the intensely responsible one, the one who stayed up late getting good grades and following all the rules. My mother, Sybil, was the grand architect of this toxic dynamic. She never missed a single opportunity to highlight our differences, always framing them in a way that left me feeling less than, feeling plain and ordinary. I remember the phone call with my mother vividly. I was bursting with my news, the words literally tumbling out of my mouth. I told her I landed the Henderson account, that it was the biggest deal in the company's entire history. There was a long, hollow pause on the other end of the line. "Oh," she said, her voice sounding completely distant, as if I had just read her the daily weather forecast. "That is nice, Corinne. Very practical." Did I tell you Maeve is thinking of taking up pottery? She saw a studio near her apartment. She has such wonderfully artistic hands. I just know she will be a natural. A familiar, heavy dull ache settled deep in my chest right then. It was a feeling of rejection I had carried with me since childhood. I told her that was great, feeling my earlier excitement deflating like a popped balloon. I hung up the phone shortly after, shaking my head to clear the intense frustration. I told myself it did not matter. What mattered was Declan. His pride in me was my solid shield against the world's little cuts. I opened my laptop on the hotel desk, clicked his name, and the screen blinked to life with a familiar chime. His face appeared, and my heart lifted instantly. His dark hair was messy, looking exactly like he had been running his hands through it all evening. And he was wearing my absolute favorite gray sweater of his, the thick knit one that made his blue eyes look even brighter through the webcam. "There's my superstar," he said, his voice a warm, rumbling sound that made me feel instantly closer to home. "Do not keep me in suspense. Tell me everything." I grabbed my laptop, walked over to the large hotel bed, and leaned back against the mountain of fluffy white pillows. I told him all of it. I described the incredibly tense final meeting, the exact moment the client finally said yes, the firm handshake, and my boss's ecstatic reaction. He listened intently to every single word, his eyes shining with pure pride. "That is my girl," he said when I finally finished speaking, his smile growing so wide it made his eyes crinkle deeply at the corners. "I never doubted you for a single second. We absolutely have to celebrate when you get back. A real celebration. This was us. This was our partnership." He was my biggest fan, my staunchest ally. The thought was as comforting to me as a heavy, warm blanket on a freezing night. He then told me about his mundane day at the office and mentioned casually that he had just gotten back from eating dinner with his parents, Lenore and Alton. Lenore and Alton were the parents I had always desperately wished for. They were kind, genuinely interested in my life, and they treated me not as a daughter-in-law, but simply as their own daughter. The love they constantly showed me was a quiet, steady anchor in my often turbulent family waters. Everything in that exact moment felt completely perfect, completely safe. It was the breathtaking, unknowing peace at the very top of a roller coaster just before the terrifying plunge downward. Settling deeper into the hotel pillows, feeling the heavy exhaustion of the last few days finally begin to recede, I smiled. "How was dinner with your parents?" I asked. "Did your mom make her famous lasagna? I have been craving it all week." "Even better," Declan said, and his smile seemed so completely genuine, so completely untroubled. "She tried that new chicken parmesan recipe you sent her. Said it was a huge hit. They both told me explicitly to tell you they miss you like crazy and cannot wait for you to be home." He went on to say that his dad was already planning a big celebratory barbecue in the backyard for my promotion. A massive wave of affection washed right over me. Lenore and Alton were simply the best. Unlike my own mother, they saw my corporate ambition not as some unfeminine, cold trait, but as something to be highly admired and heavily encouraged. We were even planning to set up a college fund soon, hoping to start our own family next year once my new position was completely solidified. We talked for another 10 minutes or so, the conversation meandering slowly through the easy, comfortable topics of a long-married couple. We talked about a leaky faucet in the guest bathroom I needed to call a plumber for, a funny movie he had watched on television the night before, and the neighbors across the street who were putting up ridiculously oversized holiday decorations even though it was only October. It was beautifully mundane. It was completely normal. Then, everything changed. He glanced at something just out of the camera's view. "Hold on a second, Corinne," he said, his brow furrowing slightly in the center. "I think I heard something downstairs. Probably just Mrs. Henderson's cat getting into the trash cans again." He started to stand up from his chair, and in that simple, fluid motion, my entire world fell completely apart. The laptop had been perched loosely on his lap, and as he rose, it tilted precariously backward. The camera angle lurched sharply downwards. For a split second, I saw the familiar, ugly popcorn texture of our bedroom ceiling. Then the lens dipped even further, creating a dizzying sweep right across the wide expanse of our king-sized bed. I saw our crisp white duvet cover. I saw my side of the bed. I saw my pillows, plumped exactly the way I always liked them. And resting perfectly on my pillow, glowing softly under the warm, yellow light of my bedside lamp, was a phone. It was not a plain black phone like Declan's. It was not my own silver phone, which was currently sitting right on the hotel nightstand beside me in Denver. This specific phone was encased in a very distinct, very recognizable clear cover. A cover filled with delicate, carefully pressed lavender and daisy flowers. It was a custom case. I knew every single tiny flower placed in that case because I had spent 2 agonizing hours on Etsy designing it myself. I vividly remembered debating with the seller over whether to include the tiny sprigs of baby's breath or not. I remembered the little thrill of excitement I felt when the package arrived in the mail, knowing exactly how much my sister would love it. It was the phone case I had given Maeve for her 27th birthday just last year. Time completely stopped. The air inside my lungs turned instantly to jagged shards of glass. It was a severe physical sensation, a sudden, violent freezing from the inside out, so incredibly intense it made me gasp out loud in the empty hotel room. My mind immediately scrambled. It began a frantic, desperate search for any rational explanation. I told myself, maybe she left it here last week when she came over to borrow my glass baking dish. Maybe she came over earlier today to water the indoor plants for me and simply forgot it. Maybe. But those pathetic excuses withered and died in my brain before they could even fully form. It was almost midnight back home, and the phone was not sitting on the kitchen counter. It was not resting on the entryway table by the door. It was laying directly on my pillow. In my bed. The camera violently shifted back up, and Declan's face filled the screen once again. He ran a hand nervously through his hair, a gesture I used to find so charming and endearing. Now, looking at him, it looked like the desperate, frantic act of a guilty man trying to quickly compose himself. "Everything okay down there?" I asked him. I felt like a completely detached observer floating above my own body, listening to my own voice as if it were coming from a great distance. It was absolutely incredible how steady and normal it sounded. I sounded calm even though inside my head a massive symphony of shattering glass was deafening me. "Yeah, all good," he said, his words tumbling out just a little too quickly, a little too breathlessly. "Just that pesky cat, always knocking over the recycling bin outside. You know exactly how it is." A cold, razor-sharp thought cut directly through the chaotic noise in my mind. We do not have a recycling bin outside our back door. We live in a townhouse complex, and we have a massive communal dumpster located all the way down the paved alley behind the units. The lie he just told was so painfully obvious, so incredibly insulting in its sheer clumsiness. He was not even trying very hard to deceive me. He genuinely thought I was that stupid, that blindly trusting. And the absolute most painful part of that realization was that until 30 seconds ago, he had been completely right. I just nodded slowly at the screen, my eyes locked dead onto his face. I deliberately let the silence stretch out between us, just watching him sweat. He fidgeted in his chair, his gaze darting rapidly away from the camera lens, completely unable to meet my eyes. I knew in that exact moment, with a dark certainty that was absolute and soul-crushing, that a confrontation over the video call would be a massive mistake. Not now. Not like this. 10 full years of marriage had taught me one fundamental truth: Declan absolutely hated being cornered. If I accused him now, he would retreat immediately. He would deny everything. He would deflect the blame. He would gaslight me until I was the one crying and apologizing to him. He would twist the entire situation around until I was painted as the crazy, paranoid, jealous wife and he was the innocent victim of my wild imagination. No. If I was going to unearth the ugly truth of my marriage, I could not use a blunt shovel. I needed a surgical scalpel. I needed to be entirely cold, sharp, and brutally precise. "So," he asked, breaking the silence, and his voice now carried a strange, brittle undertone I had never once heard before. It was a very clumsy attempt at casualness that failed miserably. I could hear the eagerness for me to finally get off the phone. I could smell the anxiety radiating through the screen, the fear that I might have seen something I shouldn't have. "When are you flying home again?" "Thursday afternoon, right? You said you had that final dinner with the executives." "That is right," I lied directly to his face. And the words slid off my tongue with a terrifying, smooth ease. My actual return ticket was booked for Thursday morning, scheduled to land just before noon. But in that split second, I clearly understood that the truth of my travel plans had just become my single most valuable strategic advantage. "The closing sessions run until 3 o'clock, I continued, making up the details flawlessly. "Then there is a big celebratory dinner with the new clients. I will probably just head straight to the airport after that wraps up. I will be home very, very late." A flicker of relief passed over his face. It was so incredibly small, so fast, that if I had not been intensely watching for it like a hawk, I would have completely missed it. But I saw it clearly. I saw the slight relaxing of his broad shoulders. I saw the almost imperceptible release of tight tension in his jawline. It was all the confirmation I needed. It was a definitive death sentence for our entire marriage, delivered silently in a single, unguarded micro-expression. If this were a divorce proceeding, that look alone would be my primary exhibit. "Great, great," he said, nodding a little too enthusiastically for a man whose wife was coming home late. "Well, I will see you then. I will come pick you up from the terminal no matter how late it is." "Actually," I said, my mind racing furiously, constructing the elaborate lie as I spoke the words. "Do not worry about it at all. A few colleagues from the West Coast branch are booked on my exact flight, and we might grab a drink at the airport bar to celebrate the new account. It will be super late. Honestly, I will just take a cab home. You should really get some sleep." "Oh, okay then," he said quickly. "If you are sure." The immense relief was much more obvious this time. The remainder of the video conversation was just a blur of meaningless, empty words. We finally said our goodnights. The phrase "I love you" felt like a disgusting foreign language in my mouth. The words were heavy, wrong, and tasted like ash. The exact moment I clicked the red end call button, the carefully constructed emotional dam inside me completely broke. The laptop screen went black, and my own reflection stared back at me in the dark glass. The composed, highly successful businesswoman from 20 minutes ago was entirely gone. In her place sat a stranger, a broken woman with a face as pale and hard as carved marble, her eyes wide with a terrifying, cold clarity. The vivid image of that lavender phone resting on my white pillow was permanently seared into the inside of my eyelids. My sister's phone. My husband. In my bed. The three short phrases looped endlessly in my mind, a toxic, repetitive, sickening mantra of betrayal. The terrifying creature I had vaguely imagined earlier now had a definitive name, and it was a hideous hydra with two specific faces I had loved and trusted more than anyone else in the entire world, and it was aggressively devouring my life from the inside out. For a terrible moment, I thought I was actually going to be violently sick. A massive wave of nausea, hot and horribly acrid, rose forcefully in my throat. I stood up on shaking legs and walked stiffly to the hotel bathroom. I gripped the cold marble edges of the vanity so tightly my knuckles turned white, and I just stared at the faucet. I forced myself to breathe. In. Out. In. Out. Tears were an expensive luxury I simply could not afford right now. Rage was a wildfire that would completely consume me before I could properly use it as a weapon. What I truly needed right now was ice. I needed to become a massive glacier, slow, freezing cold, and utterly unstoppable. I walked back into the room. My fingers, surprisingly steady now, moved across the keyboard with a strange, detached sense of purpose. I sat back down at the small desk, opened my laptop browser, and navigated directly to the airline's website. My heart was hammering violently against my ribs, feeling like a frantic bird trapped desperately in a small cage. But my hands remained precise. I clicked Find My Reservation. I clicked Change Flight. The screen loaded and showed a list of available options. The very earliest one available departed Denver at 6:15 a.m. tomorrow morning. It was scheduled to land in my home city at 10:27 a.m. I clicked it. Confirmed. The digital confirmation email appeared in my inbox less than a second later. I would be walking through my front door before noon. Step 1 was officially complete. Now for step 2. I picked up my cell phone, my thumb hovering uncertainly over my contact list. My very first human instinct was to call my best friend, to pour out the whole sordid, disgusting story, to cry and scream into the receiver and let her reassure me that I was not going completely crazy. But I couldn't do it. Not yet. This was not something I could just talk about and process over a phone call. This was something I had to physically do. I scrolled right past my best friend's name. I scrolled right past my biological mother's name. My finger finally stopped on Lenore. My mother-in-law. I quickly glanced at the digital clock on the hotel nightstand. It was almost midnight back home, but I knew from years of experience that she and Alton were often up late reading thick novels or watching old classic movies in their living room. I pressed the green call button before my mind could second-guess the chaotic plan forming in my head. She answered on the second ring, her voice a deeply welcome sound of genuine warmth and immediate concern. "Corinne, sweetheart, is everything okay? It is so incredibly late." I took a massive, deep breath and summoned a bright, cheerful tone into my voice that felt like an exhausting physical performance. It was, without a doubt, the absolute best acting of my entire life. "Everything is wonderful, Lenore," I said, forcing a laugh. "I have the most amazing news." I quickly explained a fabricated story that the conference had wrapped up a full day early due to scheduling changes, and that by some absolute miracle, I had managed to get on a flight heading out first thing in the morning. "I want to surprise Declan," I said, and the word surprise tasted like bitter battery acid on my tongue. "He firmly thinks I am not coming home until late Thursday night. I was thinking I could land, sneak into the house, get everything ready, and I was really hoping maybe you and Alton would want to come over for a big surprise lunch, say around 1 o'clock? There was a brief, staticky pause on the other end of the line, and I could faintly hear the muffled sound of her relaying the entire plan to Alton sitting next to her. Her voice came back on the line a moment later, absolutely bubbling over with genuine excitement. "Oh, Corinne, that is a perfectly wonderful idea," she practically squealed. "He has been a bit down lately, you know. He said he has been missing you terribly while you were gone. This will cheer him right up. We would absolutely love to come over." Her words were like a brutal physical blow to my stomach. Missing me terribly. Of course, he was. It must be so incredibly exhausting, living a stressful double life, juggling a wife and her sister. My hand tightened around the plastic of my phone until my knuckles were stark white. "Perfect," I said, my voice remaining impressively steady despite the earthquake inside me. "And Lenore?" Not a single word to Declan. "I really, really want this to be a massive surprise." "My lips are completely sealed, dear," she promised me, her voice full of sweet, conspiratorial glee. "Oh, this will be such incredible fun. We will see you tomorrow, sweetheart." After I hung up with her, a cold, hard knot of pure determination settled heavily in the pit of my stomach. I had my witnesses secured. Now for the absolute most difficult part of the plan. I took another long, shuddering deep breath and dialed my mother, Sybil. She answered the phone with a loud, audible sigh, acting as if my calling her was a massive, unforgivable imposition on her evening. "Corinne, do you have any idea what time it is?" she snapped. "Hi, Mom," I said, fighting every urge to scream, keeping my voice as incredibly light and cheerful as I could possibly manage under the circumstances. I am so sorry to call so late, but I have a huge surprise. I am coming home early tomorrow. My flight gets in first thing in the morning. Oh, she said flatly. The complete lack of enthusiasm was a very familiar sting, a reminder of every childhood achievement she had ignored, but tonight it barely even registered in my numb brain. That is very sudden. Yes, well, I wanted to do something very special for the family to celebrate my promotion, I continued pushing the lie. I am hosting a little surprise welcome home lunch at my house, and I was really hoping you and Dad could come over around 1 o'clock. I am inviting Lenore and Alton too. I held my breath in the silent hotel room, waiting agonizingly for her response. Tomorrow at 1, she repeated slowly, and I could hear the thick skepticism dripping in her voice. I do not know, Corinne. I think Maeve might have needed my help with her resume tomorrow. She is seriously thinking about exploring a brand new career path in graphic design. Let me check with her schedule first. The casual, automatic prioritization of her younger daughter's incredibly vague, unformed potential plans over my very concrete, planned invitation was the literal story of my entire life. It was the core reason for my therapy bills. But tonight, her toxic favoritism actually served my ultimate purpose perfectly. Mom, I said, my voice hardening just enough to cut through her nonsense and get her attention. It is very important. I really, really want you and Dad to be there. She must have heard the uncharacteristic, sharp edge in my voice, a tone I rarely ever used with her, because she finally relented with an annoyed huff. All right. All right. I suppose we can be there, she grumbled. It will be nice to see Declan at least. Is Maeve coming? I hope so, I said, the enormous lie sliding out as smooth as polished glass. I want to surprise both of them. That specific phrasing seemed to completely satisfy her maternal obsession with her youngest child. Okay, then we will see you tomorrow, she said, and hung up without saying goodbye. I placed the phone on the nightstand. I stood up from the bed and began to methodically pack my suitcase. My movements were incredibly precise, almost robotic. I folded my expensive silk work blouses, making sure to create sharp, exact creases. I placed my uncomfortable presentation shoes carefully into their individual cloth dust bags. I packed my toiletry bag, making sure the zipper was perfectly aligned. Each individual item I placed into the hard-shell suitcase felt incredibly heavy, feeling exactly like a massive stone being dropped into a bottomless, dark well. Once the suitcase was zipped shut, I set my phone alarm for 4:30 a.m. Then, I lay down completely still on top of the perfectly made, stiff hotel bed. I did not even pull back the covers. I just lay there, staring blankly at the dark ceiling, my exhausted mind becoming a violent whirlwind of ugly, chaotic, heartbreaking scenarios. I imagined the confrontation. I imagined the divorce. I imagined the absolute ruin of my life. I didn't cry a single tear. I didn't scream into the pillow. The time for breaking down and feeling the pain would come later. Right now, in the dark of this hotel room, there was only the mission. There was only the plan. When the 4:30 a.m. alarm finally went off, it was a brutal, piercing electronic sound in the dead silent room. I swung my legs out of the bed instantly, not even bothering to hit the snooze button. Genuine sleep had been entirely impossible anyway. I had spent the entire agonizing night trapped in a strange, restless, feverish state, my mind completely refusing to shut down for even a minute. Instead, it had chosen to mercilessly torment me with a high-definition, unskippable replay of every single red flag I had blindly, stupidly ignored over the past year. The early morning taxi ride to the Denver airport was a surreal blur of dark, completely empty city streets and the low, murmuring voice of a late-night news radio station the driver had playing. I stared out the window at the passing streetlights, feeling completely hollow. The airport itself was a strange oasis of harsh artificial light in the pre-dawn gloom, already humming quietly with the nervous energy of early morning business travelers and tired families. I moved mechanically through the automated check-in kiosks and the long, winding security lines completely on autopilot. I was a ghost haunting the machine of my own life. After clearing security, I bought a large, scalding black coffee and a plastic bottle of water at a small kiosk near my assigned gate. I sat down in one of the uncomfortable vinyl waiting chairs, staring blankly out the large floor-to-ceiling window at the neon-vested ground crew preparing our plane on the dark tarmac. As I sat there, my mind, entirely unbidden, continued its merciless, painful excavation of the past. I remembered that family barbecue we hosted at our house just 2 months ago. It was a picture-perfect, breezy summer day. I had been inside the sweltering kitchen for almost an hour, helping Lenore carry out heavy platters of grilled food and large bowls of potato salad. When I finally pushed open the screen door and came out onto the wooden deck, carrying a tray of drinks, I saw them. Declan and Maeve. They were sitting together on the wide wooden steps leading down to the freshly mowed lawn. Their heads were bent intimately close together, sharing a single pair of white earbuds, and they were laughing uproariously at something playing on his phone screen. Declan's left arm was draped far too casually along the back of the wooden step directly behind her, his long fingers resting just mere inches from the bare, sun-kissed skin of her shoulder. I remember stopping in my tracks. I had felt a tiny, fleeting prickle of something cold in my gut, annoyance? Jealousy? It had seemed entirely too intimate somehow, a pose meant for lovers, not in-laws. But I had aggressively dismissed the feeling instantly, ashamed of myself for even thinking it. I remembered mentally scolding myself, "Do not be ridiculous, Corinne. He is her brother-in-law. They are just good friends. You are just exhausted from preparing for this party." Now, sitting in the airport, that specific memory was slick with a deeply sinister, oily sheen. It made me want to throw up the coffee I had just swallowed. And then my mind dragged up the bizarre business with the expensive silk scarf. It happened about 6 months ago. I had been away for a long weekend, visiting vineyards with my old college girlfriends. When I finally got home late Sunday night, dragging my luggage into the hallway, I found a beautiful, brightly colored, expensive silk scarf. It was a scarf I knew for a fact belonged to Maeve. It was draped elegantly over the back of our favorite reading armchair right in the center of our living room. "Oh," Declan had said smoothly when I picked it up and held it toward him, his facial expression perfectly casual, completely unbothered. "Maeve stopped by yesterday afternoon to drop off that hardcover book you wanted to borrow. She must have forgotten her scarf when she left." He didn't even blink. "She was only here for a minute." He had seemed so incredibly plausible, so utterly, boringly normal. I had not thought twice about it. I folded the scarf and put it in a bag to return to her. What possible reason did I have to doubt Declan? My Declan. He was the man who promised to love and protect me. He wouldn't lie to me. My God, how incredibly, stupidly blind I had been. How willfully, desperately blind I chose to be, ignoring a neon sign right in my own living room. And then there was my mother, Sybil. Her role in this whole sickening, twisted play was becoming much clearer and significantly more monstrous with every single memory I unearthed from the vault. I recalled her constant, grating refrain, "You should really be nicer to Maeve, Corinne. Life is so much harder for beautiful girls, you know. People judge them. She looks up to you so much." I recalled her sickening fawning over Declan at every family holiday. "Declan is so wonderful with your sister," she would gush, pouring him more wine. "He is exactly like the protective big brother she never had growing up. He really understands her sensitive artistic temperament." Sitting at the gate, gripping my water bottle, a horrifying thought struck me. Was it entirely possible she knew? Had Sybil seen the glaring signs, too, and actively chosen to ignore them? Or, a million times worse, had she actually known about the affair and, in some deeply twisted, sick way, quietly encouraged it? Was she just happy that her precious, special youngest daughter was the absolute center of attention, even if that attention was being stolen directly from my husband? The thought was so deeply ugly, so inherently vile, that I felt a fresh, overwhelming wave of nausea wash over me. It felt like driving straight toward a funeral, the funeral of my family. The loud boarding call for my flight abruptly crackled over the intercom system, finally pulling me forcefully away from my toxic, spiraling reverie. I stood up mechanically, slung my heavy laptop bag over my tense shoulder, and quietly joined the long line of sleepy passengers shuffling toward the gate. As I sat strapped into my cramped window seat, watching the concrete ground rapidly fall away as the plane ascended sharply into the pale dawn sky, I felt a very strange, cold sense of detachment wash over my entire body. The woman I was just yesterday morning, the happy, successful, blindly trusting wife, was completely gone. She had died a silent death in a sterile Denver hotel room at exactly 11:37 p.m. the night before. The woman who was taking her place in this airplane seat was a complete stranger to me. She was freezing cold, she was highly methodical, and she was flying home not to save her broken marriage, but to perform a brutal, public autopsy on it. And she was going to make damn sure that every single person involved was present in the room to witness the exact cause of death. The flight felt like it lasted an eternity, but eventually, the plane landed a few minutes ahead of schedule, touching down with a heavy thud on the familiar, gray tarmac of my home airport. As I walked briskly through the crowded terminal, pulling my rolling suitcase behind me, I moved with a brand new, deeply unsettling sense of purpose. I was a soldier deployed on a critical mission behind enemy lines, and every single step I took was deliberate and calculated. I bypassed the baggage claim and went straight into the bustling airport restroom, but not to freshen up my makeup or brush my teeth. I needed to look into the mirror. I needed to see my own face. I dropped my bag, stood directly in front of the brightly lit vanity mirror, and took a long, incredibly hard look at the reflection staring back. The woman staring back at me was shockingly pale, her skin looking like translucent paper. Her eyes were heavily shadowed with dark circles of exhaustion and a type of grief so profound it felt like it had been there for centuries. But there was something else there, too, lurking just beneath the surface. A hard, unyielding, rigid set to my jawline that I had never, ever seen before in my entire life. This was not the frightened face of a helpless victim. This was the face of a terrifying reckoning. I walked out to the curb and hailed a yellow taxi. The driver was an older man, and his cheerful, booming "Where to, ma'am?" felt like an absurd transmission from another, happier universe. I did not give him my home address. I could not go home yet. Not alone. "First stop," I said, my voice sounding flat and commanding. I gave him the address of a house out in the affluent suburbs. I gave him Lenore and Alton's address. The drive took about 30 minutes, winding through familiar streets that suddenly looked foreign to me. When we pulled up, their charming, white-painted colonial home looked incredibly warm and welcoming, bathed in the bright late-morning sun. The front door swung open cheerfully before I even had a proper chance to press the doorbell, as if Lenore had been standing right behind it, eagerly waiting by the window. "Corinne!" Lenore cried out, her kind, lined face immediately breaking into a massive, radiant smile. She stepped out onto the porch and pulled me tightly into a fierce, suffocating hug that smelled strongly of cinnamon baking spices, home, and absolute unconditional love. "Oh, it is so incredibly good to see you, sweetheart. But my goodness, you look absolutely exhausted, you poor thing. Come in out of the heat. Alton is just getting the car ready in the garage." Alton appeared in the hallway right behind her, wiping his hands on a rag. His kind eyes, which were the exact same shade of piercing, clear blue as his son's, crinkled deeply at the corners in a warm, familiar smile. "There is our girl," he said, stepping forward and enveloping me in a massive bear hug that felt like stepping behind a protective, impenetrable shield. "Are you ready to go surprise that lazy son of mine? He has been moping around the house for days, constantly complaining that the place is far too quiet without you there." I forced a tight smile. I sat in their sun-drenched, immaculate kitchen for about 15 minutes, sipping slowly from a floral cup of hot Earl Grey tea that Lenore absolutely insisted I drink before we left. Looking at them bustling around, grabbing their coats, I felt a sudden, sharp, stabbing pang of immense guilt. These were wonderful, deeply loving people. They were currently bubbling with genuine excitement for a happy, family surprise. And I knew, with sickening certainty, that they were about to have their kind hearts brutally ripped out of their chests and stomped on, all because of the selfish actions of the man they had lovingly raised. And I was the one deliberately leading them straight to the slaughterhouse. But I pushed the guilt down. There was absolutely no other way. They had to see it with their own eyes. They deserved to know the unvarnished, unimaginably ugly truth about their son. If a lawyer was going to be involved soon, I needed them on my side. After finishing the tea and leaving their warm house, we drove in my rental car to my own parents' place across town. The feeling in my stomach as I slowly pulled into their cracked concrete driveway was completely different from the warmth of the in-laws' home. There was absolutely no warmth here at all. There was only a heavy, suffocating sense of familial obligation and the familiar, low-grade tension that always simmered dangerously just beneath the thin surface of our entire family life. My mother, Sybil, opened the front door, her face already set in an expression of deep impatience. She was wearing a stiff blouse and holding her purse like a shield. "Corinne, you are here," she stated flatly. It was not a warm, maternal greeting. It was just a cold statement of fact. "Harlan," she yelled loudly over her shoulder into the dark house, not even bothering to take her critical eyes off my wrinkled travel clothes. "Corinne is here. We have to leave right now if we want to be on time for this little party." My dad, Harlan, slowly appeared in the dim hallway, shuffling his feet slightly. He was a quiet, perpetually gentle man who had learned decades ago that it was infinitely easier to simply retreat into the background wallpaper than to ever attempt to stand up to my mother's incredibly formidable, overbearing personality. He walked out to the porch and gave me a hesitant, slightly awkward, one-armed hug. "Good to have you home, kiddo," he mumbled softly into my hair, patting my back stiffly. "So, what is all this dramatic fuss about?" my mother demanded loudly as we all walked down the driveway toward my waiting rental car, her heavy leather purse clutched tightly in her hand like a weapon. "A surprise lunch? It is all very dramatic of you, Corinne. We had things to do today." "I just wanted to do something nice for everyone," I said, my voice sounding incredibly tight and strained. My hands clenched the leather steering wheel so hard my joints ached. "Well, is Maeve meeting us there?" she asked immediately. Her focus, exactly as it always was, immediately shifted away from me and directly onto her favorite child. I tried calling her cell phone again this morning, but it went straight to voicemail. "She is probably just sleeping in. You know how she absolutely needs her beauty rest." The casual, offhand mention of Maeve's cell phone sent a massive, paralyzing jolt of ice water straight through my veins. The image of the lavender case flashed brilliantly in my mind. "I do not know, Mom," I said, throwing the car into reverse and pulling out of their driveway with a slight jerk. The lie was getting terrifyingly easier to tell, which scared me a little bit, but I couldn't stop now. "I guess we will all be surprised." The 5-mile drive from my biological parents' house back to my own townhouse was unequivocally one of the longest and most excruciating psychological journeys of my entire life. Lenore and Alton sat together in the back seat alongside my dad, trying desperately to make pleasant, polite conversation to cut the tension. They talked about the unseasonably warm weather and Lenore's recent prize-winning roses she had grown in her garden. My mother sat directly in the passenger seat beside me, acting as a silent, intensely critical presence. I could literally feel her sharp eyes boring into the side of my face, her brow furrowed into a permanent little frown of disapproval. It felt exactly like crossing a barren, hostile desert with no water in sight. The air inside the confined space of the car was incredibly thick and suffocating. It was a strange, nauseating cocktail of forced, polite cheerfulness coming from the back seat and dangerous, simmering tension radiating from the front. Lenore's light, happy chatter about her local garden club served as a completely surreal, bizarre soundtrack to the massive Category 5 hurricane currently raging inside my own head. Alton and my father occasionally murmured polite, non-committal responses, but their overall contributions to the chat were very sporadic. They were just two good, simple men caught in an awkward social situation they fundamentally didn't understand, just trying their best to be pleasant. But the real, crushing weight in the car was located in the passenger seat right next to me. My mother, Sybil, had fallen completely and utterly silent. She was not looking out the window at the passing scenery, and she was not checking her phone. She was just sitting there, staring rigidly straight ahead at the dashboard, her lips pressed tightly into a thin, angry, disapproving line. I could feel waves of her trademark disapproval radiating off her body. Disapproval of exactly what? My sudden spontaneity? My supposedly dramatic lunch plan? Or was it something much deeper, much more primal? Did she, on some deep subconscious level, somehow sense that this entire charade was really about Maeve? Did a mother's intuition tell her that her perfect, precious, flawless daughter was standing dead center in the eye of the terrifying storm I was currently driving us all directly into? I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles completely bone white. My breathing became incredibly shallow, my chest rising and falling in tiny, rapid movements. Every single rational instinct I possessed was screaming frantically at me to just slam on the brakes, turn the car around, abort the entire insane mission, and just go home to confront Declan alone. I could just deal with the horrible fallout in the privacy of my own living room. But I forced myself to think clearly. What would that actually achieve? It would ultimately be my word against his. And against Maeve's. They would inevitably team up. They would concoct a unified lie. They would manipulate the facts. And my mother, without a single shadow of a doubt, would become their willing, eager accomplice, quickly painting me as the hysterical, paranoid, deeply jealous older sister. I could practically see the whole sickening narrative playing out in my head right then and there. I could hear Sybil's voice defending them, poor Maeve. She was just innocently comforting Declan because he was so terribly lonely while you were away working. Corinne is always so busy with her career, always chasing her salary and promotions. You know how she is. She completely misunderstood the situation. She's just being crazy. No. Absolutely not. That was not going to happen. Not to me. The ugly truth, in all its naked, horrifying glory, desperately needed a captive audience. It required unbiased witnesses who absolutely could not be gaslit or manipulated after the fact. This betrayal was no longer just a private, sad matter between a failing husband and a broken wife. They had made the active choice to make it a family affair the exact moment they decided to bring my own flesh and blood sister into my marital bed. And so, the entire family would bear witness to the reckoning. I finally turned the steering wheel, making the final turn into our neighborhood. I saw our house sitting quietly at the very end of the cul-de-sac. I saw the cheerful, freshly painted blue shutters framing the windows. I saw the magnificent, sprawling oak tree in the front yard. My dad had actually helped us install and plant that tree together on our very first wedding anniversary. It had been just a tiny, fragile sapling back then, but now it was a towering, leafy symbol. A symbol of what, exactly? 10 years of lies? 10 years of a fake marriage? From the outside, the house looked exactly like a glossy picture ripped straight from a home and garden magazine. It was a perfect, square little box promising a perfect, happy little life inside. My life. The life that was an absolute, complete lie. The life I was about to detonate from the inside out in just a few short minutes. I slowed the car down and pulled smoothly into the concrete driveway, parking my rental car right behind Declan's sleek black sedan. His car was here. Of course, it was here. Where else on earth would he possibly be on a random Wednesday morning? I shifted into park and turned off the engine. The sudden, absolute silence that fell over the inside of the car was completely deafening. "All right, everyone," I said, and my voice sounded strange and hollow inside the confined space of the rental car. "Remember, we absolutely must be completely quiet. I really want to get his genuine reaction on camera." I held up my cell phone, my thumb hovering over the screen. It was a complete lie, a necessary piece of stagecraft. It was the excuse I needed to demand absolute silence from the 4 adults sitting in the car with me. They all nodded, their faces showing a mixture of anticipation and slight confusion. I took one last sweeping look at them in the rearview mirror. Lenore and Alton were beaming with immense love for the son who was about to break their kind hearts. My father, Harlan, was looking vaguely uncomfortable, shifting his weight in the seat, but going along with it simply to keep the peace. My mother, Sybil, had her facial expression locked into a tight mask of extreme impatience, acting as if this entire surprise was a massive waste of her valuable time. Not a single one of them had any clue that they were seconds away from their world being turned completely upside down. I opened the car door and stepped out onto the concrete. My legs felt strangely unsteady beneath me. I walked slowly up the paved walkway toward the front door, the metal house key feeling freezing cold in my hand. I slid the key into the brass lock. It turned with a soft click. To my ears, it was the definitive sound of a heavy key opening a tomb. I took one last deep breath of the warm suburban air, and I pushed the heavy wooden door open. The house was incredibly quiet. It was a deep, unnatural quiet that felt entirely wrong for the middle of a weekday afternoon. The air inside the hallway was completely still and felt unusually stuffy. The very first thing I saw, the absolute first physical clue that confirmed my darkest fears, was a woman's coat. It was a highly stylish, camel-colored wool trench coat. It was exactly the kind of expensive designer coat that my sister Maeve constantly coveted. I had never actually seen this specific coat before, but it absolutely screamed her personal style. It was flung carelessly over the rounded back of the antique floral armchair sitting in our entryway. That specific chair was the one my grandmother had left me in her will, a precious piece of my family history. "Oh," Lenore said very softly from directly behind me in the doorway, her happy smile finally faltering as she took in the scene. "Is he having company over for a work meeting?" Before I could formulate a proper response, my mother's sharp eyes darted down to the floor right by the base of the wooden stairs. "Well, look at that," Sybil said aloud, and there was a strange, unreadable note in her voice. It was recognition. "Those are Maeve's shoes. I just bought those exact shoes for her last month for her birthday. They cost a small fortune." Lying there on the polished hardwood floor, kicked off with the kind of careless haste that heavily suggested extreme urgency, was a pair of bright red, high-heeled shoes. They were Maeve's signature style. A rolling wave of hot nausea washed over me. The camel coat. The red shoes. The damning evidence was piling up piece by piece before we had even taken 5 steps inside the walls of my own home. My father and Alton exchanged a highly confused, deeply uneasy glance. The festive mood had completely evaporated, instantly replaced by a thick, anxious silence. They were all looking directly at me now, their eyes wide with unspoken questions. I kept my face frozen into a blank mask. I offered them no explanation. I just slowly, deliberately raised a single trembling finger to my lips, signaling forcefully for them to remain absolutely silent. Then, I pointed my finger directly up the wooden staircase. And at that exact moment, we all heard it. It started as a very low, muffled murmur of voices drifting down from the second floor, coming exactly from the direction of the master bedroom. Then came the specific sound that would be burned into my memory for the rest of my life. It was a woman's light, airy, carefree giggle. It was a sound I had known intimately since she was a baby. It was my sister's giggle. And it was followed merely a second later by Declan's deeper, rumbling, familiar chuckle in direct response. The intimate sound echoed loudly in the silent house. It was the distinct sound of shared private secrets, of 2 lovers completely at ease in their hidden sanctuary. My sanctuary. Lenore's hand flew up to violently cover her mouth, her eyes widening with a massive dawning horror. Alton's kind face instantly hardened into a terrifying mask of solid stone. He looked down at the red shoes on the floor, then up to the staircase, and then his piercing blue gaze locked directly with mine. The question burning in his eyes was a desperate, silent plea. I met his gaze without flinching. I gave him a slow, highly deliberate nod. His broad face crumpled in agony, and he pulled his quietly crying wife tightly into his strong arms. My mother, Sybil, just stood there completely frozen. Her face was a bizarre canvas of utter confusion, showcasing a stubborn refusal to connect the incredibly obvious dots. She looked down at the red shoes. She listened to the happy laughter floating down from upstairs. And then she looked directly at me, her facial expression still unnervingly blank. There was no horror there. Not yet. There was just a strange wall of denial. I turned away from the four of them and started walking up the stairs. My feet felt exactly like heavy lead weights. I moved very slowly, my right hand gliding smoothly along the cool, polished wood of the banister. I could feel their heavy, oppressive presence directly behind me. It was a reluctant, utterly horrified procession following me up the stairs to witness the brutal execution of my 10-year marriage. Each individual wooden step creaked softly under our combined weight. With every single upward step I took, the intimate sounds coming from the master bedroom became significantly clearer. They were not just talking. They were laughing. They were relaxed. They were happy together inside my house, inside my bedroom, inside my bed. We finally reached the top of the stairs. The hallway landing was relatively dark. The only bright light came from the thin sliver of space glowing underneath the master bedroom door at the very end of the hall. The heavy wooden door was pushed slightly ajar, and from directly behind it, I could hear Maeve's voice now, clear as a ringing bell. "Oh, you need to stop it right now," she was saying in a highly playful, deeply flirty tone that made my stomach churn. "You are being terrible." And Declan's voice, my husband's voice, the man who had promised to love and honor me, replied smoothly, "You know you love it." We stood there for a long, agonizingly stretched out moment in the dim upstairs hallway. The playful, highly intimate conversation from behind the bedroom door continued effortlessly. Each spoken word acted as a separate, jagged stab wound directly to my bleeding heart. They were completely and utterly oblivious, happily wrapped in their sordid bubble of betrayal. Lenore was crying silently now, tears streaming down her face, her body shaking violently with heavily suppressed sobs as she buried her face deep into Alton's shoulder. Alton held her incredibly tightly, his own face a terrifying mask of cold, unforgiving, murderous fury. My father looked extremely pale and physically sick, his eyes fixed permanently on that partially open door. And my mother just stared blankly, her face still a bizarre landscape of mass confusion and aggressive denial. It was exactly as if her brain was simply refusing to process the overwhelming evidence presented to her senses. I looked at each of them one last time. I was giving them one final, silent chance to turn back around, to walk down the stairs and spare themselves the horrific sight of what I knew was hiding behind that wooden door. But they did not move a single muscle. Their loyalty held them firmly in place. They were in this nightmare with me now until the bitter end. I took a massive, deep breath. The air inside the hallway felt incredibly thin. I walked the final few steps down the carpeted hall. I reached the wooden door. I did not knock politely. I did not hesitate. I raised my right hand, placed it completely flat against the cool, smooth wood, and I shoved it forward with all the physical strength I possessed. The heavy door swung violently inward with a solid thud, crashing aggressively against the interior drywall. The sudden, explosive noise made them both jump violently. The scene the open door revealed will be forever seared into my brain. The large room was a complete disaster. Clothing was strewn carelessly all over the floor. I saw Declan's expensive blue button-down work shirt. I saw Maeve's flimsy floral sundress. Two empty, expensive crystal wine glasses sat casually on my wooden nightstand, right next to my framed wedding photograph. The heavy blackout curtains were drawn tightly closed, casting the entire room in a dim, shadowy afternoon light. And there, right in the exact middle of our large bed. My bed. There were my husband and my sister. They were tangled completely together under the white cotton sheets, propped up comfortably against the fluffy pillows, a silver laptop open and playing a movie directly in front of him. They were completely naked. Their bare shoulders touched intimately. Maeve's long blonde hair was a massive, messy halo spread out across my pillow. For a single heartbeat, the entire world stopped spinning. The only sound I could hear was the frantic, panicked pounding of my own blood rushing in my ears. Then, Maeve slowly looked up from the glowing laptop screen. Her playful, satisfied smile completely froze on her face, then instantly melted away into absolute horror. Her eyes widened into massive saucers of sheer terror as she finally registered the large crowd of people standing silently in the bedroom doorway. She saw me. She saw his weeping mother. She saw his thunderous father. She saw my shell-shocked parents. All the color rapidly drained from her face. She let out a small, strangled gasp and instinctively reached down to pull the white duvet cover forcefully up to her chin to cover her bare chest. Declan turned his head, looking highly annoyed at the sudden interruption, following her terrified gaze toward the door. When he finally saw the crowd assembled in his bedroom, his jaw went completely slack. His face transformed instantly from relaxed contentment to utter, humiliating panic. He looked exactly like a man who had just been struck by lightning. "Corinne," he breathed out, his voice a hoarse, incredulous whisper. "What? What are you doing here right now? You are supposed to be in Denver until late Thursday night." The sheer, breathtaking stupidity of his question, the absolute gall of him choosing to focus entirely on my travel itinerary in the face of this massive apocalypse, was what finally broke the horrified spell in the room. A sound violently escaped my lips. It was not a coherent word. It was not a sad sob. It was a dry, highly brittle, completely humorless laugh that sounded exactly like thick silk being torn forcefully in half. "Clearly," I said, and my voice was as freezing cold and razor-sharp as a jagged shard of ice. "I came home early. If you have made it this far, please do me a favor, like the video and comment number 1 down below. It lets me know how awesome you are and shows that you are right here with me on this journey. Your support is a massive encouragement and truly motivates me. Drop that one so I can recognize you, and now, let us get back to my story." The bedroom, which had been frozen in a terrifying state of shock, suddenly erupted into a massive, chaotic symphony of shame, screaming, and fury. Lenore let out a loud sob that was half gasp and half wail, burying her face even deeper into Alton's broad shoulder. My father, Harlan, physically stumbled backward a full step into the hallway, one hand flying aggressively to his chest exactly as if he had just been shot. Declan and Maeve scrambled frantically in the bed, creating a pathetic, frantic tangle of bare limbs and white sheets, trying desperately to cover their nakedness from their parents. It was a clumsy, humiliating dance of pure shame. "Mom. Dad," Declan stammered loudly, his eyes darting wildly between his parents' furious faces. "This is not. I swear to God this is not what it looks like. I can explain everything." "Explain?" Alton's voice was a low, incredibly dangerous rumble that genuinely seemed to shake the floorboards. He took one massive, menacing step directly into the bedroom, his big frame completely filling the doorway. "Explain exactly what, Declan? That you are sleeping with your wife's sister inside your wife's bed? There is absolutely no explanation for this. There is only filth." Maeve, ever the eternal drama queen, immediately started crying loudly. But these were not quiet, remorseful tears of regret. They were the big, theatrical, gulping sobs she had perfected since childhood. They were the specific kind of tears explicitly designed to quickly elicit sympathy from our mother and immediately deflect all blame away from herself. "Corinne, I am so incredibly sorry," she wailed loudly, clutching the white sheet desperately to her chest. "We did not mean for this to happen. We fought it for so incredibly long. It just happened. It just happened?" I repeated her ridiculous words, my voice dripping with toxic venom. "Really, Maeve? Did it just happen when you deliberately unbuttoned your dress? Did it just happen when you willingly climbed naked into my bed? For exactly how long has this been just happening right behind my back? She just cried much harder, aggressively refusing to meet my burning eyes, hiding her face behind her messy curtain of blonde hair. But the real blow, the specific wound that would ultimately prove to be the deepest of all, did not come from my cheating husband or my treacherous sister. It came directly from my own mother. Sybil finally moved her feet. She stepped forcefully past me in the doorway, her movements incredibly stiff, and she walked directly into the bedroom. But she did not look at me. She did not look at Declan. She walked purposefully to the right side of the bed where her youngest daughter was weeping loudly, and she looked down at her with intense concern. And then, she slowly turned her head and pinned me to the wall with a look of pure, burning fury. "Corinne," Sybil said, her voice incredibly sharp and heavily accusatory. "Why on earth would you do this? Why would you deliberately stage this horrible, public spectacle?" Her words simply did not compute in my brain. I stared at her, completely dumbfounded, my exhausted mind refusing to process what I had just heard her say. "What?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "Mom, did you actually just hear what you said to me? I staged this? Look at them in my bed. They did this. You could have easily handled this situation privately," she hissed at me, her eyes blazing with a strange, fierce, protective fire. But it was a fire that burned exclusively for the wrong daughter. "You could have been an adult about this, but no. You had to drag all of us over here. You knew exactly how sensitive your sister is. Did you really have to humiliate her like this in front of everyone? This is just cruel, Corinne. Absolutely, unnecessarily cruel." The entire world violently tilted on its axis and spun rapidly into pure blackness. My husband had betrayed me in the worst way possible. My sister had betrayed me. And now, in the single most painful, most devastating moment of my entire life, my own biological mother was standing in the absolute wreckage of my marriage, pointing a furious, accusing finger not at the two naked perpetrators in the bed, but directly at me. I was actively being blamed for discovering the truth. It felt exactly like sitting in the front row of my own funeral. Lenore lifted her tear-streaked face from Alton's shoulder. "Are you completely insane, Sybil?" she sobbed loudly, her voice incredibly thick with heavy disbelief and pure disgust. "Have you completely lost your mind? Your oldest daughter just found her husband in bed with your other daughter, and you are worried about humiliation? Corinne is the absolute victim here. Your son," she spat the word violently at Declan, "and your daughter are despicable, morally bankrupt people." Alton pointed a trembling, highly authoritative finger directly at Declan. "Get dressed. Both of you. And then, Declan, you get out of this house right now. Do not speak to me. Do not look at me. As far as I am concerned, I no longer have a son." My mother's toxic words echoed loudly in the suffocating silence of the room. "You knew how sensitive your sister is." Sensitive. That one single word was the spark. It was the lit match dropped casually into the massive puddle of gasoline that had been pooling inside me for my entire life. All the heavy years of being aggressively pushed aside, of being the reliable, boring one while Maeve was the special, delicate one. All the casual, cruel dismissals of my hard-earned achievements. It all came rushing back in a violent flood. It was a massive tidal wave of pure resentment and agonizing pain so immense it finally broke the surface. I turned my body to face my mother, and the loud voice that came out of my mouth was a raw, guttural, terrifying sound. It was the distinct sound of a deeply wounded, cornered animal. "Sensitive?" I screamed at her, the word physically ripping from my throat. "You want to talk to me about being sensitive? For 32 years, I have listened to you praise her just for breathing, while you aggressively criticized me for actually achieving something. I put myself through college. I paid off my own student loans with my salary, while you and Dad completely drained your retirement savings to fund her fake artistic journey to nowhere. We even talked about setting up a college fund for a baby we wanted to have, while you were completely consumed with coddling her. Every single time you made me feel like I was not nearly enough, like I was a massive disappointment simply because I was not her. My whole body was shaking violently with a rage so completely pure and white-hot it felt incredibly cleansing. I was pointing a violently trembling finger directly at Maeve, who was now cowering behind Declan's back. And this is exactly what she does with that sensitivity. This is your precious, sensitive little girl. She sneaks into my house. She sleeps naked in my bed with my husband. And you have the absolute audacity to stand there in my bedroom and defend her? To blame me? I took one large, aggressive step toward my mother, who actually flinched visibly and took a quick step backward. Have you ever actually seen me, Mom? I sobbed loudly, the angry words tearing out of me now. Have you ever, for one single second in your life, looked at me and been genuinely proud of me? Or am I just the invisible background character in the Grand Maeve show? Even now? I am the ultimate villain of your twisted story simply because I dared to pull back the curtain on her disgusting behavior. Hot, furious tears were finally streaming rapidly down my face. I am done, I choked out. I am so entirely done with all of you. My burning gaze swept aggressively across the room, landing harshly on Declan, then on Maeve, then on my own pale parents. My voice dropped to a low, shaking, and utterly final command. Get out. They just stared at me, completely frozen in place. I said, I repeated, my voice rising rapidly to a full-throated roar, get out of my house. Declan. Maeve. And you too as well. I looked directly into my stunned parents' eyes. Get out right now. Harlan, my dad, looked completely and utterly broken. He just turned around slowly, his shoulders slumped heavily in defeat, and he walked silently out of the bedroom, down the hall, and out of the house without speaking a single word to me. Declan and Maeve finally scrambled frantically into action, grabbing their wrinkled clothes from the floor. My mother stood her ground stubbornly for one more second. Her mouth opened wide as if she were about to argue. Do not, I warned her, my voice dropping back to a deadly, freezing quiet. Do not you dare say another word to me ever again. Her mouth snapped shut instantly. She stared at me, her face a bizarre mixture of intense anger and profound shock, and then she turned sharply on her heel and quickly followed my father out of the room. Declan, now hastily dressed, absolutely would not look at my face. He grabbed his car keys and his leather wallet from the wooden dresser and practically ran full speed out of the room. Maeve scurried out right behind him exactly like a frightened rat. I followed them all slowly down the wooden stairs. I stood frozen at the open front door and watched them pile hastily into my parents' car. I watched intensely until the car backed quickly out of my driveway and disappeared completely down the street. I reached out and slammed the heavy front door shut. The loud sound echoed violently through the suddenly empty, silent house. It was the definitive end to the entire life I once knew. And then, there was only silence. The absolute only people left inside the house were me, Lenore, and Alton. The air was incredibly thick with heavy pain, profound betrayal, and an unspoken, massive grief. I just stood there in the entryway, my body trembling violently. I felt completely hollowed out. I stumbled blindly over to the floral armchair in the living room and sank heavily into it. I wrapped my arms tightly around my own waist and just stared blankly at the opposite wall. I could not cry anymore. I was far beyond normal tears, existing in a strange place of pure shock. Lenore was the very first person to move. She walked over and knelt directly on the floor in front of my chair. She did not say a single word. She just reached out and took both of my freezing, trembling hands firmly in hers. Her hands were incredibly warm and very steady. It was a very small, vital point of human contact in a dark world that had just gone completely cold. She held my hands tightly, rubbing very small, comforting circles on my knuckles with her thumbs until the violent shaking in my body finally began to subside into a low, steady tremor. Alton stood dead in the center of the living room, his big hands clenched into tight fists at his sides. He looked directly up the stairs toward the master bedroom, and his strong jaw was extremely tight with a rage that was all the more frightening for its complete silence. Then, he turned around, his physical movements incredibly stiff and highly purposeful. "Right," Alton said loudly, his voice incredibly rough. "First things first." He walked heavily back up the wooden stairs. I sat completely still and heard him moving rapidly around in the master bedroom above me. A few minutes later, he came walking heavily back down the stairs, his large arms laden with a massive, messy ball of fabric. It was absolutely everything from my bed. It was the white sheets, the heavy duvet cover, the pillowcases, the blankets. It was absolutely everything Declan and Maeve had touched. He carried the massive bundle with an expression of utter disgust. "We are burning this," he stated, his voice completely flat and highly final. "We are getting all of this disgusting filth out of your house right now." And that is exactly what we did. In a very strange, deeply cathartic hour, the three of us worked together in near absolute silence. Alton carried the massive bundle of desecrated bedding directly out the back door to the heavy metal fire pit in the backyard. He heavily doused the entire pile of fabric with lighter fluid, and without any ceremony whatsoever, he dropped a lit match directly onto it. The bright orange flames whooshed violently to life, aggressively consuming the physical symbols of my ultimate betrayal in a thick plume of greasy, dark black smoke. We stood together and watched it burn to absolute ashes. While the fire raged hotly outside in the yard, Lenore went directly into the hallway linen closet and came back carrying a fresh, clean set of crisp sheets. She walked upstairs and aggressively stripped the mattress completely bare. Then, together in silence, the two of us perfectly remade my bed. The simple, repetitive domestic act was profoundly healing. We smoothed out the wrinkles in the cleaned sheets. We were actively erasing them from the room. While I then went slowly through the entire house, carefully collecting the few random things Maeve had carelessly left behind, throwing them violently into a black garbage bag, Lenore went downstairs into the kitchen and started brewing a fresh pot of coffee. The rich, highly familiar smell slowly began to fill the lower level of the house. It was a very small act of normalcy that aggressively pushed back against the sordid atmosphere they had intentionally left behind. We eventually sat down at my kitchen table, the three of us, quietly sipping hot black coffee from heavy ceramic mugs. The silence in the house was no longer ringing loudly. It was much softer now. It was a shared, quiet space of profound grief. "Corinne," Alton finally said, his deep voice incredibly thick with heavy emotion. "I am so incredibly sorry. I honestly do not know what to say to you. I look at what he did today, and he is not the man we raised. I do not know who that person is." "It is not your fault," I whispered back, the spoken words heavily scratching my sore throat. "None of this is your fault. You and Lenore, you have absolutely been more of a real family to me than my own ever was." Lenore reached across the wooden table, her warm hand covering mine completely. Her touch was extremely firm. "We are your family, Corinne," she said fiercely, her eyes locking intensely with mine. "That fact does not change. Do you hear me? Nothing that happened here today changes that. If anything, it makes it much stronger." In the dark, painful hours that followed, they officially became my shield. They did not leave my side for a second. They helped me search for and call an emergency locksmith to have every single lock on the exterior doors changed immediately. They sat with me as I made the most difficult phone call of my life to a lawyer. They ordered pizza delivery when Lenore realized that not a single one of us had eaten a single bite of food all day. When they finally prepared to leave the house late that evening, Lenore hugged me incredibly tightly at the new front door. "Call us for absolutely anything," she commanded me gently. "I truly mean it. If you wake up at 2 in the morning and you simply cannot stand to be alone in this house, you call us immediately. We will be over here in 20 minutes. You are not alone in this." That night, I absolutely could not bring myself to sleep in my own master bed. I dragged a blanket and slept fitfully on the small bed in the guest room. I lay wide awake for hours, staring blindly into the pitch darkness. The heavy betrayal was a severe physical pain. But underneath the massive weight of the emotional pain, something else was slowly beginning to grow. It was a tiny, incredibly cold, very hard seed of pure resolve. They had actively tried to destroy me. I would absolutely not let them win. The long days that slowly followed were an exhausting blur of tedious administrative tasks and profound emotional exhaustion. I was forced to take an immediate emergency leave of absence from my job, completely unable to even contemplate facing my corporate colleagues. My promotion felt very far away. My very first meeting with my lawyer was an eye-opening experience. Her name was Ms. Davis, and she was a sharp, impeccably dressed woman with a reputation for being a shark. Sitting in her sterile office was a very harsh dose of reality. I sat in the leather chair and told her the entire, horrific story from start to finish. My voice was completely flat. She listened very intently, occasionally jotting down quick, sharp notes on a yellow legal pad. When I finally finished speaking, she put down her expensive pen and looked directly at me. "Corinne," she said, her voice incredibly firm. "First of all, I am deeply, deeply sorry you are currently going through this. What you have just described to me is a highly profound betrayal. Second, you did absolutely the right thing legally by securing witnesses before the confrontation. It makes the at-fault aspect of this impending divorce infinitely clearer for the judge." She proceeded to explain that the standard prenuptial agreement Declan and I had signed many years ago was relatively solid, but his flagrant, undeniable infidelity gave us massive legal leverage. She confidently assured me the legal process should be relatively straightforward. It was absolutely anything but straightforward. Exactly 2 days after I officially filed the legal divorce papers, the brutal counterattack began. Declan hired a notoriously aggressive, highly expensive lawyer known heavily for his scorched-earth courtroom tactics. The very first legal letter arrived via a specialized courier service. It was an absolute masterpiece of legal gaslighting. The letter boldly claimed that Declan was fully entitled to exactly half of absolutely everything we owned, heavily including the physical house. It aggressively argued that the massive down payment, which had come directly from a very substantial inheritance I had personally received from my grandmother, should be legally considered a shared marital gift and thus was completely subject to division. The disgusting letter went on to absurdly claim that my supposedly erratic behavior in deliberately staging a public confrontation was absolute proof of my deep emotional instability. They were actively trying to paint me legally as the absolute villain, the crazy wife who aggressively drove her poor husband into the arms of another woman. The deepest, absolute most painful cuts during this time came directly from my own biological family. My mother, having been completely blocked on my phone, started relentlessly emailing me. They were incredibly long diatribes that swung wildly between desperate pleading and outright emotional blackmail. "You are completely tearing this family apart, Corinne," one email read. "Maeve is an absolute wreck. She cannot eat anything. She cannot sleep at night. She could very easily lose her job over all this intense stress. You absolutely have to find it in your heart to forgive them. It was just a mistake." A mistake? I finally asked her during one particularly awful phone call, after she had somehow managed to get through to me by using my father's cell phone. My voice was dangerously calm. "A mistake is forgetting to pick up a gallon of milk from the grocery store," I said, my knuckles white gripping the phone. "Systematically lying to my face and sleeping naked with your sister's husband is absolutely not a mistake, Mom. It is a long series of highly deliberate, incredibly selfish choices. You are being so incredibly cold, so unforgiving," she sobbed loudly into the phone receiver. "What happened to the sweet, kind-hearted girl I raised?" "She died," I said, my voice completely flat. "She died last Wednesday afternoon right in her own bedroom. You were standing right there when it happened." And I forcefully hung up the phone. I officially blocked my father's cell phone number, too. Then the text messages started arriving. It was a constant, relentless barrage from Maeve, using burner numbers. They were incredibly long paragraphs completely filled with sickening self-pity and highly manipulative nonsense. In her twisted version of the story, she was the real victim of the entire situation, and I was just the cruel sister who had absolutely everything. Through all of this incredible toxicity, Lenore and Alton were my absolute, unwavering support system. They came over and helped me sort through years of incredibly dense financial paperwork, desperately searching for the specific banking documents explicitly proving the exact source of the inheritance for the house down payment. Alton sat patiently with me at my kitchen table for hours on end. He meticulously went through hundreds of bank statements and investment accounts, ensuring that every single one of my premarital assets was perfectly protected. When Declan's aggressive lawyer actually tried to claim a future stake in my earnings from my newly anticipated corporate promotion, claiming he had supported my career, Alton swiftly provided my lawyer with years of my excellent performance reviews and precise salary statements. He methodically proved to the judge that my massive career success was the direct result of my own intense hard work and had absolutely nothing whatsoever to do with any supposed emotional support from Declan. One dark evening, Alton sat across from me at my kitchen table. He looked directly at me. "Corinne," he said, his voice incredibly heavy. "I really want you to know this fact. If it actually comes to it, if they try to drag this entire messy thing into a public courtroom, both Lenore and I will gladly take the witness stand. We will put our hands flat on a Bible, and we will publicly testify against our own son. We will tell the judge exactly what we saw in that bedroom, and exactly what your mother said to you. He is our son and we love him, but what he did to you was completely wrong. And in this fight, we stand with you 100%. The horrific thought of these two genuinely wonderful people actually having to publicly testify against their own flesh and blood in a courtroom was heartbreaking. But their absolute, unwavering loyalty was a powerful balm to my heavily shattered soul. After 6 long, incredibly brutal, and soul-crushingly expensive months, the massive legal divorce was finally finalized. Faced with the undeniable threat of the devastating testimony from his own parents, and the completely ironclad financial documentation of my inheritance, Declan and his expensive shark of a lawyer finally backed down. The judge officially awarded me the house outright and completely protected all of my premarital assets and my future salary earnings. Declan walked away from our 10-year marriage with absolutely nothing but his personal clothing, his car, and his exact half of our very modest joint checking account. I fervently hoped I never had to see his face or my sister's face again for as long as I lived. The ugly legal battle was officially over, but I knew deep down that the emotional one was really just beginning. The physical house, my beautiful house that I had fought so incredibly hard to keep in the divorce, now felt exactly like a massive, cold mausoleum. It was absolutely no longer a home. It felt like walking through the aftermath of a funeral every single day. Every single room held a specific memory that was now entirely tainted. I knew I absolutely could not heal there. So, I made a very radical, highly impulsive decision. I called a local real estate agent and I aggressively put the massive house on the market. It sold for cash in less than a week for significantly over the original asking price. Standing entirely alone in the empty, echoing house on the final closing day, handing the keys over, I felt a massive, profound sense of physical release. I was finally closing the heavy wooden door on that horrific chapter of my life. With the massive cash proceeds from the sale safely in my bank account, I did something I had never imagined I would actually do. I went online and booked a one-way airplane ticket directly to Italy. I packed 2 large suitcases with my favorite clothes. I put the entire rest of my life into a large storage unit, and I just left the country. I did not tell a single soul I was leaving, except for Lenore and Alton. For 3 incredibly glorious months, I wandered entirely alone through Italy. I started my journey in Rome, where I spent my long days intentionally getting lost in the winding, ancient cobblestone streets. I ate rich gelato for lunch every single day. Slowly, day by day, I could physically feel the tightly coiled anxiety in my chest begin to finally unwind. From Rome, I took a very loud train to the coast and hiked the absolutely breathtaking trails of Cinque Terre. The salty sea air felt exactly like it was forcefully cleansing my tired lungs. Finally, I ended up renting a place in a tiny, incredibly quiet village deeply hidden in Tuscany. I spontaneously enrolled in a week-long cooking class. The class was run strictly by a highly cheerful Italian grandmother named Nana Sofia. She did not speak a single word of English. We communicated entirely through wild hand gestures and the beautiful language of fresh food. In the incredible warmth of her bustling kitchen, completely covered head to toe in white flour, I felt a tiny, genuine flicker of pure joy spark in my chest. Slowly, I started to finally feel exactly like myself again. I was just Corinne. I was simply a woman who genuinely loved classic art, the smell of the sea, and the sharp taste of fresh basil. One warm afternoon, sitting lazily at an outdoor cafe in Florence and enjoying a strong espresso, I finally connected my phone to the internet and checked my personal email. Tucked quietly among the spam was a very short message from my father. It was the very first direct communication I had received from him since that horrible day in my bedroom. The subject line was simply, "I am incredibly sorry." My hand trembled violently as I clicked to open it. The email was very short. He did not make any pathetic excuses for my mother. He did not make any excuses for Maeve. He simply stated clearly that he was incredibly sorry for his profound silence. He apologized deeply for his massive weakness, for entirely failing to stand up for me when I desperately needed him the absolute most. He stated clearly that he had completely failed his job as a father. He ended by saying he sincerely hoped that one day, I would somehow find happiness again. I sat there at the small metal cafe table, staring blindly at my glowing phone screen, as hot, heavy tears finally streamed rapidly down my face. They were the very quiet tears of a profound emotional release. I did not reply to his email. I was absolutely not ready for that step yet. But I did not delete the email either. When I finally, officially returned to the United States 3 months later, I absolutely did not go back to my old town. I officially transferred my job and moved to a small, incredibly charming city a few hours away. I found a very lovely, incredibly cozy little townhouse situated on a quiet, tree-lined street. I started completely over. I officially transferred to a massive regional office of my company, finally taking the massive promotion and the large salary increase I had rightfully earned. My brand new corporate colleagues were incredibly welcoming, and I slowly began to cautiously build a very small circle of trusted friends. But my absolute true family remained Lenore and Alton. They would happily drive down the highway to visit me at least once every single month. Their car was always heavily loaded with massive containers of homemade food. They happily helped me pick out new furniture. They enthusiastically advised me on exactly which colorful flowers to plant in my new garden. They sat comfortably with me on my new back patio, drinking iced tea and just talking for hours on end. But even with my wonderful new life, there was still a very small, quiet ache deep inside my heart. Even back when I was heavily married to Declan, I had always known that I desperately wanted to be a mother. Now, living my completely new life entirely on my own terms, I realized something incredibly profound. I absolutely did not need a husband to have a family. I could build one entirely myself. I officially began the incredibly long, highly arduous legal process of child adoption. The required paperwork was an absolute mountain to climb. The necessary home studies were highly invasive and stressful. There were many days when I felt completely overwhelmed. But Lenore and Alton were my absolute biggest cheerleaders. They happily wrote glowing character references for the adoption agency. They drove down to help me deep clean and extensively baby-proof my entire house. They aggressively celebrated every single small milestone. A full year after I submitted my very initial application, I finally got the phone call that changed my entire life forever. A 5-year-old little girl named Willa urgently needed a permanent home. The assigned social worker told me over the phone that she was incredibly quiet, very shy, and had been sadly bounced around between several different foster homes for almost the entirety of her young life. My heart ached physically for her. The very first time I actually met her, it was in a highly sterile playroom. She immediately hid terrified behind the social worker's legs. I absolutely did not rush her. I simply sat down quietly on the carpeted floor a few feet away, and I started talking to her. I just talked softly about the sparkly red shoes she was currently wearing. After about 20 long minutes of sitting on the floor, she finally took one highly hesitant step toward me. I knew deep in my heart, in that very exact moment, that she was my daughter. 3 months later, after an absolute whirlwind of final legal proceedings and transition visits to ensure custody was fully finalized, the adoption was complete. Willa finally came home with me. The specific day I brought her to her new house for good, Lenore and Alton were already there, waiting anxiously on the front porch. Willa was highly nervous, her little hand clinging incredibly tightly to my fingers. Alton was holding a giant, incredibly fluffy brown teddy bear. Lenore was holding a large plate of her famous, homemade chocolate chip cookies. They patiently let her lead the interaction. Within a single hour, Willa was happily giving Alton a highly solemn tour of her new pink and purple bedroom, and then she was sitting comfortably on Lenore's lap in the big comfy armchair. Watching them together, my heart, which I honestly thought had been permanently scarred, felt exactly like it was rapidly stitching itself back together. This was my absolute family. It was a family built absolutely not on shared blood or forced obligation, but on completely pure, absolute unconditional love and deliberate choice. It was the absolute most beautiful thing I had ever known. The years that slowly followed were undeniably the happiest years of my entire life. The once quiet townhouse was constantly filled with the incredibly loud sounds of a child's pure laughter. Watching Willa slowly grow was a massive gift. We recently celebrated her 8th birthday with a massive, incredibly chaotic party in our backyard. The little garden I had painstakingly cultivated over the long years was in absolute full bloom. Willa's friends were running wildly through the spinning water sprinkler. Lenore and Alton, whom Willa had instantly christened Nana and Papa, were happily manning the barbecue grill. And my father, Harlan, was there, too. After I had returned from Italy, he had reached out again, and we had met for coffee. It was incredibly awkward at first, but it was a solid start. He never made any excuses for my mother's horrific behavior. He slowly started visiting us. He turned out to be a highly doting, incredibly gentle grandfather to Willa. He would sit patiently for hours, slowly teaching her exactly how to play chess. Our relationship was absolutely not what it once was, but it was something entirely new, something completely honest, and for right now, that was more than enough. My mother and Maeve were just a highly distant memory. I heard very briefly through my father that they had both moved to a completely different state a few years back. Apparently, Declan had actually followed Maeve there after our massive divorce, but their highly toxic relationship had been extremely tumultuous and had eventually imploded in a highly dramatic, public fashion. I genuinely felt absolutely nothing for them anymore. Not burning anger. Not deep sadness. Just a massive, vast indifference. That sunny afternoon, as I was carefully lighting the 8 candles on Willa's giant birthday cake, I briefly caught Alton's eye directly across the grassy yard. He was proudly watching Willa as she enthusiastically tried to teach my dad a highly silly dance. He slowly looked over at me, his blue eyes crinkling deeply at the corners, and he gave me a massive smile of such completely pure joy and absolute contentment that it completely took my breath away. In that single, highly perfect moment, standing in my garden, holding the cake, I was completely overcome with a profound sense of pure peace. The brutal betrayal that had aggressively shattered my entire world years ago had absolutely not been the end of my story. It had simply been an absolutely necessary new beginning. It had been exactly like a massive forest fire that had aggressively burned away an entire fake life. And from those dark ashes, something entirely new, incredibly beautiful, and massively strong had slowly grown. That horrible day had directly led me to Willa. It had deeply solidified my unbreakable bond with Lenore and Alton. It had aggressively taught me that I was significantly stronger, infinitely more resilient, and much more highly capable of pure love than I ever thought possible. That warm night, after the loud party was completely over and Willa was finally tucked deeply into her bed, I sat alone out on my little stone patio. I had a large glass of dark red wine in my hand. I looked up at the vast night sky and I thought deeply about the woman I used to be. The quiet woman who genuinely thought her entire happiness was completely dependent on her husband and her toxic mother. I honestly barely recognized her anymore. The woman I was right now was a proud, fiercely protective mother. She was a deeply cherished daughter to the two incredible parents who actively chose her. She was the sole, highly independent architect of her own pure joy. The lavender phone case on the pillow, the loudly slammed bedroom door, the bitter tears. They were all just necessary, highly painful steps on an ultimately beautiful path. It was the exact path that had directly led me right here. Home. Truly, finally, and completely home. Thank you so incredibly much for listening to my story today, for sitting quietly with me through the absolute darkest parts. If you have ever been through something even remotely similar, if any small part of this long story resonated with that hidden, painful place in your own heart, please absolutely know that you are not alone in the dark. Sometimes the absolutely deepest wounds, the most completely unthinkable betrayals, are the very exact things that forcefully lead us directly to our absolute greatest strengths and our most entirely authentic lives. Please, if you feel comfortable doing so, share your thoughts or a piece of your own amazing story in the comments below. Your stories absolutely matter to me. This is a highly supportive community and we are all significantly stronger together. Take care of yourselves out there, and please, take care of each other.